Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. Rain strangled Cinderfall that night, dragging black streams down every street until the city looked like it was bleeding itself empty. It wasn't the kind of rain that shocked you awake or turned to ice. It was worse. Persistent, patient. It slipped through fabric, through skin, until it settled deep in the bones and refused to leave. A low growl of thunder crawled across the skyline, echoing off abandoned factories and sealed-up shops that hadn't seen honest business in years. The sound rolled past clinics with flickering signs and churches with bells that no longer rang, until it reached the lonely stop at Ash and Memorial. There the Route 7 waited. The bus didn't move. It just breathed, wipers slapping back and forth in a tired rhythm, like a pulse that didn't want to keep going but did anyway. Yellow paint dulled by decades of grime, windows fogged from the inside. It looked less like transportation and more like something caught between decisions. Inside, harsh white lights buzzed overhead, vibrating at a pitch that drilled straight into the skull. The smell was wrong. Cleaners tried to cover it, but they always failed. Beneath the disinfectant lingered damp wool, old sweat, cheap sanitizer, and that unmistakable scent of people who were never quite home, always passing through. Beyond the rain-smeared glass, iron gates loomed across the street. The cemetery entrance rose like a jaw locked mid-screen. Twisted metal curled into decorative shapes that once meant beauty, now peeling and rusted, flacking away in jagged strips. The graves beyond leaned at uneasy angles, as if the ground itself was slowly reclaiming what it had been promised. Near the gate stood a stone angel, eroded by decades of poisoned rain. Its face was smooth where features should have been. Its arms lifted in a gesture that could have been a blessing or a warning. The fingers were gone. At the wheel sat Frank Holloway. He held it like the bus might try to escape him, both hands tight, knuckles pale. His face carried the dull gray of a man who worked while the world slept and slept while the world lived. 53 years etched into his skin. 2 marriages behind him. Nothing ahead he cared to name. On the dashboard sat a small porcelain doll, glued in place so it wouldn't slide when the bus turned. Jet black hair, painted eyes too glossy, too aware. Its smile never changed. Frank didn't remember deciding to keep it, only that it had been left behind one night, sitting upright in an empty seat. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself it was luck. Luck never showed up. A few rows back, seat 7B, Gregory Dalton leaned over a glowing screen. His thumb moved in quick, thoughtless swipes, the reflex of someone trained to work anywhere, anytime, regardless of comfort or sanity. 34 years old, still chasing titles that came with conditions attached, still proving himself to people who already owned his time. His tie hung loose but stayed on. Taking it off would mean surrender. His jacket rested behind him, damp at the edges. The collar of his shirt showed faint discoloration from too many long days between cleanings, evidence of ambition grinding quietly into neglect. The clock above the driver read 11:47 p.m. The bus door sighed, then closed again. No one else boarded. Frank glanced at the cemetery through the glass, then at the mirror. For just a second, he thought he saw movement where no passenger sat. The doll's reflection seemed closer. He blinked, the moment passed. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the bus waited. And somewhere between the living city and the ground that swallowed names, Route 7, prepared to collect its fare. Time was something Gregory no longer owned. It slipped past him unnoticed, like spare change lost between couch cushions. The glow of the tablet carved his face into something sharp and hollow, the blue light pooling beneath his eyes until he looked less alive and more preserved. His skin took on a sickly pallor, the color of milk left out too long. His fingers tapped out another message, dense, lifeless language about clauses and contingencies, sent to someone who wouldn't open it until morning, but would still count the minutes past midnight. Gregory didn't question that contradiction. He hadn't questioned much in years. Logic stopped knocking around the same time food lost its flavor, around the time he forgot his nephew's name, around the time sleep became something that arrived only with a prescription label. Lightning tore open the sky. For a split second, the world outside turned white, and in that flash, the cemetery was wrong. Too close. The iron gates pressed against the bus windows as if they'd slid forward when no one was looking. Headstones crowded nearer, their crooked shapes looming where empty streets should have been. Then darkness slammed back in. Thunder followed, loud and brutal, like something massive being dragged across the ceiling of the world. Frank's hand twitched toward the door lever. He didn't touch it. The clock said 11:47. The schedule said 11:49. And Frank Holloway did not run early. The storm worsened, rain hammering the roof in heavy bursts, wind rocking the bus on its tired frame. Still, Gregory didn't look up. His universe had narrowed to the size of the screen, to the single question that haunted every waking hour. Would the word provisional finally disappear from his title, or would he be replaced by someone younger, cheaper, and hungrier? At 11:48, the door sighed open. Frank hadn't moved. The woman who stepped inside didn't so much walk as arrive, like fog slipping through a crack, like a memory finally deciding to surface. Her age refused definition. She could have been 80, or she could have been older in a way that clocks didn't measure. She was dressed entirely in black, not modern black, but the deep, deliberate black of old mourning clothes, the kind worn by women in century-old photographs whose eyes seem to follow you no matter where you stand. A small hat perched atop her head, a veil spilling down, the mesh so fine it barely hid her face. What features remained suggested a beauty long ago surrendered to time and gravity, skin pulled tight over bone, everything drawn downward toward the inevitability beneath. She moved slowly, deliberately, each step chosen with care, like someone negotiating joints that had begun to stiffen, bones quietly preparing to return what they once borrowed from the earth. In her right hand, she carried a black handbag with a metal clasp, the kind that snapped shut with a sharp, final sound. In her left hand, nothing at all. Frank watched her through the mirror, his lips parted out of habit, ready to recite the fare. Exact change only, no exceptions. But the words never came. They caught somewhere deep in his chest, where instinct overruled routine, and a cold understanding settled in its place. The words stuck in Frank's mouth, trapped behind his teeth. He watched as the woman opened her handbag. She didn't take out paper money. She didn't reach for a card. She produced a coin. Silver, worn smooth by centuries of passing from hand to hand. The kind of silver that remembered names the city no longer used. From a time before highways carved the land apart, before engines replaced horses, before the ground outside held so many dead. She dropped it into the fare box. The sound it made was wrong. Not a clink, not a rattle. It rang soft and distant like a church bell heard through fog and stone. The digital display blinked. It should have demanded exact change. Instead, a single symbol appeared. A coffin. Gregory never noticed. The woman moved down the aisle and settled into the seat across from him. Seat 7A, she smoothed her skirts with careful hands, placed the handbag on her lap, and folded her fingers atop it as though preparing for a formal portrait. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward Gregory. The motion was unnerving, precise, mechanical. She studied him without hurry, the hollowness under his eyes, the faint twitch pulling at his left eyelid, the way his thumb moved across the glass in endless repetition, no different from factory labor, just disguised by clean fonts and corporate language. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across stone, like pages turning where no one stood to read them. You look worn down. Gregory's thumb froze. His eyes flicked toward her, then snapped back to the screen. His jaw clenched. The muscle jumped as he silently counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The technique drilled into him during a mandatory seminar after someone in accounting finally broke. She didn't stop. So many words, she said gently. So many hours. His thumb resumed its motion. His silence sharpened into irritation. Leave me alone. The woman tilted her head. The angle was wrong, as if her neck bent farther than it should have, vertebrae stacking one after another. Would you care for a frightening little story? The tablet flickered. Just a blink, barely there. Gregory jabbed the screen, heart skipping despite himself. The display stabilized. Battery 87%. No reason for that, none at all. He didn't answer her, didn't look at her. He curled in on himself, shoulders rising, posture trained by years of commuting alongside strangers who talked to ghosts only they could see. Ignore them long enough, they go away. But she didn't. It won't take long, she said softly. Her hands rested patiently on the handbag. She waited, and for the first time all night, Gregory Dalton hesitated. The resistance finally broke, spilling out as clipped, irritated words. I'm busy. Go bother someone else. She received the dismissal the way stone receives rain, without reaction, without injury. No offense crossed her face, no surprise. She continued, calm and unwavering, as if he'd never spoken at all. There is a story, she said, about a man who was carefully filed away. The way she said it, steady, assured, inevitable, made something inside Gregory hesitate. He lifted his head and met her gaze through the veil. Her eyes were deep and dark, carrying a patience that felt endless. The look of someone who wasn't waiting for anything, who could remain seated in that place for decades if necessary. His mouth open, closed. A sharper version of himself wanted to tell her off, to draw a clear line and shove her to the other side of it. But that voice was tired, exhausted beyond anger. The part of him that had forgotten why he kept grinding, why he stayed late, why he boarded this bus night after night. That part stayed quiet. She took the silence as permission. Once, she began, there was a man who labored endlessly. Too much, some whispered, but he never listened. Gregory's thumb went still. He stared at the tablet as the text smeared, letters bleeding into one another like ink in the rain. He had always worn his endurance like armor. He measured his worth in output, in hours squeezed tight, in the belief that he mattered because he was useful. He told himself the company needed him, that he couldn't be replaced. Outside, lightning inverted the world. The cemetery flared white against a black sky. Shadows flipped inside out. In that flash, the stone angel seemed to fix its hollow gaze on the bus, on that exact row of seats. One night, the woman continued, he stayed later than he ever had before. Her voice dipped lower, and the lights above them buzzed in response. The cleaners finished their rounds. The guard checked his doors. The warmth drained from the building as systems powered down. Still, the man worked, sending messages meant for the morning, completing tasks no one would touch for days. Gregory didn't blink. Eventually, near midnight, he decided he'd done enough. He saved his files, closed his machine, took his coat and his case. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button to go down. The woman hadn't moved. Her hand still rested atop her handbag. Her spine remained straight. Yet somehow, impossibly, she felt nearer, like the space between them had quietly collapsed, while Gregory was too distracted to notice. And the story was only just beginning. But the elevator didn't stop where it was supposed to, the woman said softly. It went the wrong way. Her words settled heavy in the air. It descended, past the lobby, past the levels he knew. B1, B2, B3, floors that were never listed, floors that shouldn't have existed at all. Gregory's tablet went black. He frowned, thumb stabbing the power button once. Then again, harder, nothing. His chest tightened as memory rushed in 87%. Plenty of charge. Devices didn't die at 87%. In the story, the man panicked. He ran for the stairs, she continued. But the stairs only led downward. Step after step, deeper and deeper, past logic, past blueprints, past the depth the earth should allow. Gregory swallowed. And with every level, she said, leaning closer, he felt himself thinning. The veil hid her face, but her eyes gleamed, round and reflective, like coins dropped into a well and left there for centuries. In the descent, his body began to change. He flattened, light. His skin stiffened, turning pale and fibrous. His thoughts compressed, memories trimmed down, loves, fears, names reduced to save space. Gregory's hands began to shake. He realized just before the change was complete, she whispered, that he was no longer a man. Perhaps he never truly was. He was an entry, a record, a resource, something to be stored, measured, and eventually discarded. Gregory slammed his palms against his thighs, grounding himself. His voice came out harsh, brittle. That's ridiculous. The woman eased back into her seat, studying him as one might study a reflection. Is it? She asked. That depends on whether you still believe you're flesh and breath, or whether you've already become something lighter. Well, I'm a human being, he snapped, the word being cracked as it left his mouth. She didn't argue, she didn't smile. She simply watched. The silence stretched wide and hollow until Gregory could hear his own breathing echo inside it. The bus felt cavernous, empty. He looked down. The tablet remained dead. He pressed the power button with desperate force. Once, twice, again, nothing. His fingers felt wrong, slow, stiff, like they didn't quite remember how joints were meant to work. The device slipped. He lunged to catch it. His hands passed straight through. A sound escaped his throat, thin and broken. He raised his hands into the light. They weren't gone, not yet. But they weren't solid either. Light bled through them the way it bleeds through paper held against a window. Beneath his skin, shapes showed faintly, bones like watermarks, tendons stretched like lines of faded text across parchment. His breath came shallow. No, he whispered. The tablet flickered back to life. 3 words filled the screen in massive, unforgiving letters. File not found. The woman spoke gently, almost kindly. You've been archived, Gregory. There was no malice in her voice, no warmth either, just certainty, clean and final, like a diagnosis delivered without ceremony. The system had moved on. Space was required. Priorities shifted to something newer, quicker, more hopeful. Someone who still believed effort might be rewarded. Gregory tried to scream. What came out wasn't human. The sound tore from him as a low, metallic whine, the exhausted sigh of machinery powering down for the last time. His arms sealed against his sides. His legs fused together. His spine bent at angles no body should ever bend, folding inward again and again, collapsing in on itself like something being packed away with ruthless efficiency. Then the noise stopped. What remained in seat 7B was not a man. It was a crumpled sphere of yellowed paper, creased and overused, dense with ink so tightly pressed it was no longer readable. If you leaned close, you might make out fragments, dead language about productivity and value, but it was all mashed into meaninglessness. Outside, the storm battered the bus. Rain pounded like it wanted in. The woman calmly reached across the aisle, lifted the paper bundle, and turned it once, twice, inspecting it as though checking an inventory list. Satisfied, she slipped it into her handbag. The clasp snapped shut. Sharp vinyl. She stood and moved toward the rear of the bus, her steps measured, unhurried. At the wheel, Frank Holloway was frozen, his hands welded to the steering wheel. His reflection stared back at him in the mirror, eyes blown wide, whites showing like he'd seen the end of something sacred. He had. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. Not a scream, not a word, just a dry click, the sound of a man whose mouth had forgotten how language worked. The woman took a seat near the back exit. Across from her sat another passenger, oblivious. A young woman held her phone high, face perfectly framed by a glowing ring of artificial light clipped to the case. The glow erased texture, softened flaws, turned her into a smooth, luminous shape. She spoke rapidly to the screen, voice bright, exaggerated, rehearsed. Every word was performance, not conversation. Her name was Jessica, 23. Thousands of followers across platforms that rose and fell by the minute, ruled by invisible systems she didn't understand, but obeyed without question. Numbers that dictated her worth more decisively than any parent ever had. She wore expensive workout clothes that had never seen a gym. Her stomach was flat and exposed. Her hair held its shape despite the storm outside. Her makeup was flawless, engineered to survive sweat, tears, and collapse. She smiled at herself. Behind her, the bus continued its route, and the woman in black watched quietly, waiting for the next fare. Her lips gleamed with a carefully chosen shine, the kind of color that survived market testing and algorithm approval. She was mid-rant, words spilling fast about image management, audience trust, and how no one truly understood her vision. It wasn't dialogue. It was content, meant to be sliced, polished, and uploaded later. Then the woman beside her spoke. The interruption sliced clean through the performance. Jessica's eyes darted sideways for a fraction of a second, clocked the figure next to her, and dismissed it. Old women barely existed in her world unless they held money or novelty, something wholesome enough to trend. This woman offered neither. Jessica turned back to her phone, continuing her monologue about authenticity, about being unseen and misunderstood. The woman waited. Then, gently, she tried again. Would you care to hear a frightening story? Jessica exhaled sharply, a practiced sigh heavy with inconvenience. She lowered the phone but kept the camera rolling. Footage could always be trimmed. Reality was flexible. "I'm kind of busy," she said, irritation tucked beneath a thin layer of professionalism. The woman nodded. "Then perhaps you prefer the story of the permanent filter." The words landed differently. Jessica hesitated. Just last month she paid a small fortune for software that reshaped her face in real time, softening skin, refining angles, erasing fatigue. The numbers had surged overnight. Praise poured in. But lately something felt wrong. Without the filter, her reflection looked unfamiliar, distorted. The mirror had started to feel like the problem. She adjusted her phone, pretending disinterest while framing herself with care. She didn't respond, but she listened. The woman folded her hands calmly. "There was once a young woman who wanted beauty," she began. "Not the old kind, left to chance and bone structure, but the modern kind. The kind promised to everyone. The kind delivered by technology." Jessica's thumb hovered above the screen. The woman's voice deepened, and the bus seemed to shrink around them. She found a filter that didn't just improve her face, it perfected it. Every pore erased, every imbalance corrected, every flaw smoothed away until what remained was flawless. A pause. "Not human perfection," the woman added softly. "Something else, like a mannequin resembles a person, close enough to fool the eye, empty enough to forget what was lost." The glow of the ring light felt harsher now. And Jessica, for the first time, didn't know whether to keep recording. Outside, the storm reached its breaking point. Rain slammed down so hard the city dissolved into a smear of gray. The world beyond the glass reduced to motion and noise. The girl in the story used the filter constantly. Every photo, every video, every time she checked her reflection, and the audience adored it. They praised her glow, her eyes, her effortless beauty. They asked for routines, products, secrets. She never told them. The filter was the secret. The woman's gaze lingered on the bright ring of light around the phone. For a heartbeat, her eyes seemed to shine back, bright and animal, like something caught in headlights. Then her voice continued, unbroken. "One day, the girl noticed something strange," she said. "When she lowered her phone, the image didn't disappear." Jessica's grip tightened. It stayed, hanging in the air like a ghost of herself. The perfect face remained while the real one moved away. The rain battered the roof in violent waves. She realized then that the device wasn't just showing her image anymore. It was taking it, piece by piece, mapping every feature, training itself on her until there would be no difference between her and the model it was building. Jessica's hand began to tremble. The ring light shook, casting warped shadows that turned flawless makeup into something theatrical, tragic. And when she finally looked into a real mirror, the woman said, she saw the change. Jessica swallowed. The skin smoothed, the texture vanished, but not beautifully, not naturally. It softened the way wax does when it melts, edges blurring, features losing definition. The bus seemed quieter, closer. The phone had taken her face and left behind a blank surface, something unfinished, something waiting to be filled. Jessica shook her head, voice climbing with fear. That's not how it works. It's just software, it's just... Try it, the woman said gently. Jessica lifted her phone. Her fingers moved on instinct, opening her favorite filter, the one that turned her into something porcelain, something timeless, something unreal. The filter activated. On the screen, her perfected face appeared, smooth as polished stone, eyes widened to an idealized glow, lips tuned to the exact color proven to hold attention. But it didn't move. Jessica turned her head left. The face on the screen stared forward. She turned right. It didn't follow. Her breath hitched as she lowered the phone and stared directly at it. The filtered face remained, still perfect, empty. And it wasn't wearing her expression. Wasn't her expression. The image had slipped its anchor. The copy no longer cared about the original. Jessica lifted her free hand to her cheek, needing proof. Her fingers made contact. Skin. Smooth. Too smooth. She pressed harder, expecting resistance. The familiar softness over bone, the tiny landscape of pores and lines that made a face real. There was nothing. No texture. No give. Just a slick, perfect surface, like touching polished plastic warmed by lights. Her eyes dropped to the phone. The face on the screen was smiling. Not her smile. It was wider, hungrier. Teeth lined up in flawless rows, unnaturally white like tiles in a showroom bathroom. Panic surged. Her hands raced across her face, searching nose, lips, the curve of eye sockets. There was nothing to find, just a blank oval stretched tight, a mask with no openings. She tried to scream. There was no mouth to scream from. The phone flared brighter. On the screen, the perfected face opened its mouth impossibly wide. Not a mouth anymore, but a tunnel, a throat, a dark, pulling space. Jessica felt the tug. Her body, Lure imagined, YouTube-ready narrative, cinematic horror, continued. G'd forward, not violently, inevitably. She folded inward, collapsing and narrowing, flowing toward the screen like liquid pulled by gravity. Limbs elongated, flattened, spiraled until there was nothing left to resist. In the rearview mirror, Frank Holloway watched it happen. He saw the young woman stretch and vanish into the glowing rectangle, swallowed whole by the image she'd spent years perfecting. Then the phone hit the floor with a hollow clack, sliding to a stop face-up. The screen lit once. New follower. Then it went black. The woman in black bent down, joints creaking softly, and picked up the phone. She turned it over with quiet interest, as if studying an unusual insect. Satisfied, she slipped it into her handbag, nestling it beside a ball of yellowed paper. The clasp snapped shut. Frank made a sound, small, broken. Not quite a sob, not quite a whimper. The noise of a trapped animal realizing escape is no longer an option. She stood and walked toward the front of the bus. Her steps made no sound on the rubber floor. Frank followed her progress in the mirror, frozen, hopping stillness might pass for invisibility. She stopped behind him. Seat 1B. The seat for arguments, for accusations, for people who needed the driver to listen. She leaned forward. Frank, just his name. He felt his blood turn cold. He had never told her. His badge only showed an initial and a last name. That should have been all. His hand shook on the wheel as the storm raged outside. And the Route 7 kept moving forward. Frank's throat tightened around his own name. Frank. The word carried everything he had lost. His mother's soft voice from the bedroom upstairs. His first wife's screams echoing down hallways. His daughter's silence stretching 6 years too long. Birthdays and recitals he'd missed. Moments that could never be reclaimed. His croaked question trembled through the cabin. Where did they go? What did you do to them? The woman's gaze was calm. I told them stories, she said. True stories, stories that demand payment. Frank's eyes flicked to the porcelain doll perched on the dashboard. It hadn't moved, its painted smile fixed in the same eternal expression, its hair glossy as always, hands folded in tiny prayer. Yet, hadn't the hair been shorter yesterday? And weren't the eyes different now? Black, deep and endless with no iris, no white, only a pupil stretching outward, infinite. "You're some kind of witch," he rasped. "Some kind of demon." Her reply was soft, almost tender. "I'm a storyteller, one of the oldest, older than you imagine. We've been with humans since the first fire, the first cave, the first voice that wondered about the sounds in the dark. Someone always spun words to explain them." Thunder rolled over Cinderfall. The rain had eased, but the wind had risen, tossing the bus like a boat anchored in storm. Frank's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles pale. I don't want stories. I want to finish my shift. I want to go home." The woman leaned closer, voice flat, observational, not cruel, not kind, just fact. "Home, apartment 4C in Riverside Complex. Sheets unchanged for 3 weeks. A pile of unpaid bills next to leftover takeout. The television always on to drown out the silence. Silence that let you think. And thinking added up the years, summed mistakes, left accounts that never balanced." Frank closed his eyes, stopped. "She didn't. Would you like to hear a scary tale, Frank?" "No." "Too bad," she said, and the bus seemed to shrink around them, her voice weaving through it like wind through dead leaves or pages turning in an empty library. "You need to hear the tale of the doll." Frank's eyes snapped open. He stared at the dashboard. The porcelain doll had changed. Its smile gleamed brighter. Its black hair had grown, spilling in dark waves that caught the fluorescent light. She began. "Once there was a bus driver who kept a porcelain doll on his dashboard for luck. He had found it 3 years ago, left behind in a seat by some passenger who never returned. It had been small, harmless, comforting, until the stories began. Inside, something ancient and patient had been waiting." Frank's hands froze in midair. The doll wasn't just porcelain anymore. It had a presence, a weight, a pulse that didn't belong to any toy. Its hair now pooled across the floor like ink spilled in slow motion, thick and alive, dragging shadows along with it. He leaned closer, heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was imagination. Maybe it was the storm, the long night, the isolation. Maybe. But then the movement beneath the hair caught his eye. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. Something wriggled inside the doll's shell, pushing against porcelain walls, seeking a way out. Frank's breath caught in his chest. The woman's voice came soft and calm, brushing against the back of his neck like ice. "It's not a toy," she whispered. "It's a vessel, a story waiting to be told, and you're part of it now." Frank wanted to pull back, to move, to escape. But the doll's presence had already rooted itself in the bus, in the night, in him. He could feel it reaching through the air, wrapping around his thoughts, entwining with his fear. He exhaled sharply, his pulse racing. Every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity, a darker, older curiosity, pushed him closer. His trembling fingers hovered again, brushing against the silky weight of the hair. It burned with heat and cold at once, a contradiction that shouldn't exist, and yet did. Then he saw it clearly, not empty, not lifeless. Inside the shell, something small and grotesque, folded and patient, blinked, and the eyes, so tiny, so human, yet alien, locked with his. And in that moment, Frank understood. The doll had been waiting for him, for someone to notice, for someone to awaken it. The woman leaned back, a shadow against the storm outside, and smiled faintly. The bus creaked, the wind rattled the frame, but inside, a quiet horror had settled. Frank realized with a sinking certainty that the porcelain smile on the dashboard was no longer the doll. It was his. And it was watching. The thing inside the doll had been patient, biding its time, expanding slowly, learning, waiting. Now it had outgrown the fragile porcelain shell, stretching, writhing, demanding more, something human-sized, something with bones to fill, a skull to claim. Frank's instincts screamed. He lunged for the door lever, yanked it down. The doors hissed open and a hurricane of rain and wind slammed into him, carrying the damp, iron-heavy scent of the cemetery. He tumbled out, knees hitting the gutter, soaked instantly by the icy sheets of water. He scrambled upright, eyes darting back toward the bus. The doorway held a vision that froze his blood. The woman stood there, unmoving, and beyond her, the bus interior had vanished. Nothing remained but a gray, roiling void, formless and endless. "I am not going back in there," he shouted, voice lost in the wind. She descended the steps with the deliberate patience of smoke unfurling, of a memory coiling into shape. "You didn't let me finish," she said. Her words slid over him, soft and inexorable. Then Frank noticed it, his hands. The skin was changing, gleaming, smooth as wet porcelain. He tried to move his fingers. They didn't obey. The joints fused, locking into rigid curves. His spine cracked and stretched, vertebrae fusing with tiny pops that echoed in his head like bubble wrap bursting. "No, please," he whispered, helpless. Legs pressed together, arms locked at his sides, his face frozen in absolute terror, the expression settling into eternal horror. His body shrank, collapsing in on itself. Clothes bled into skin. Colors swirled and merged until he was no taller than a figurine, 3 inches, 6, 9, compressed into a tiny, perfect shell. The woman bent and lifted him gently. He was exquisite, every detail of the uniform perfect, the fake metal name tag gleaming, the eyes wide in silent recognition of a fate that could not be escaped. She carried him back to the bus, placing him on the dashboard beside the original doll. From her handbag, she retrieved a tiny tube of superglue, securing him in place. The smell of adhesive thickened the air. She stepped over the now empty doll, the vessel whose purpose had ended, and slid into the driver's seat. Her hands found the controls instinctively, decades of experience in vehicles of every kind flowing through her. Covered wagons, horse-drawn carriages, diesel locomotives. The mechanisms might change, she thought, but the story, the rhythm of control, the hum of engines, remained eternal. Outside, the storm continued to roar, but inside the bus, the air held a new stillness, a quiet horror and inevitability, as if the world itself had bent to watch the tableau of fate unfold. The dolls stared, witnesses to the truth no human could ever unsee. Some stories, once begun, demand completion, and those who ignore them become part of the tale themselves. The principle had always been the same. Stories came with a price, and sometimes that price wasn't counted in coins. She adjusted the rearview mirror, scanned the side mirrors, and shifted the bus into gear. The engine roared to life effortlessly, obedient as if it had always known who was in control. Her gaze swept the dashboard, a crumpled ball of yellowed paper, a cracked cell phone, 2 porcelain dolls, one ancient, one new, both frozen in their permanent smiles. For a heartbeat, her reflection wavered in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the elegant woman anyone expected. Beneath the veil, skin as pale and cold as November rain, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, jaw slack on rotted tendons. Then just as quickly, the image snapped back. The poised old woman returned, veil perfectly in place, calm and unreadable. She eased the bus from the curb. The gates of the cemetery sank behind them into the storm-soaked streets of Cinderfall, guiding the vehicle forward to Lakeside Station, to transfer hubs, to destinations dictated not by maps, but by the roots of stories themselves. Wipers swung rhythmically. The engine hummed a low, steady note. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed almost ordinary, almost safe. Then she did something no one expected. She stopped the bus in the middle of the street, shifted it into park. Rain drummed on the roof like a heartbeat, relentless and insistent. Slowly, impossibly, she turned in her seat, eyes lifting to meet yours, through the screen, through distance, through the barrier between the tale and the listener. Her gaze was ancient, infinite, eyes that had watched stories bloom and die since the first human dared to question the dark. "Next stop," she said softly, "is yours." The interior of the bus seemed to stretch and breathe around her words. The fluorescent lights dimmed, brightened, and dimmed again, a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat, or something far older, predating hearts, predating blood, predating the fragile vessels we call bodies. She leaned forward deliberately, the veil sliding aside. What appeared beneath defied comfort, a face shifting between the old woman, a corpse, and something neither alive nor dead. Features wavered and snapped back before your mind could fully register them. A smile stretched too wide, then collapsed into normalcy, leaving a shadow of unease in its wake. Her voice emerged, omnipresent, threading through the bus, through the rain, threading into your very thoughts. "How about you? Would you like to hear a scary tale?" The question lingered thick as mist, suspended like the instant between lightning and thunder, the pause before a verdict. She waited. The bus waited. The rain waited. And somewhere deep in the spaces between, the story waited for you. The porcelain dolls on the dashboard seemed alive in their silence, their painted eyes witnessing a scene they had known long before and would witness long after, trapped in an eternal present where passengers always boarded and stories always demanded a price. Beyond the rain-streaked windows, the cemetery had returned, or perhaps it had never truly left. The gate stood ajar, iron scrollwork twisting into shapes that might have been letters in a language lost to time. Beyond, headstones stretched into the darkness, each one a quiet witness to the passage of years. The stone angel's hollow eyes now brimmed with rain. "The route has many stops," the woman's voice drifted softly across the bus, calm and patient. "But they all lead to the same place. Every road, every path, every story terminates where the gates stand open, where the earth waits, and the only question is whether you will walk quietly, or if you will need convincing." She reached into her handbag one last time. When she withdrew the coin, silver and old, it gleamed with a light that had nothing to do with metal, everything to do with the weight of debts long owed. She held it up between thumb and forefinger like a magician poised before the vanish, and the lesson was clear. Nothing is free, not passage, not safety, not the stories we cling to in the dark. The coin seemed to multiply, spinning, cascading into a river of silver that spilled like water through her fingers. "Your stop is approaching," she said. "The route is fixed. The schedule cannot change." The night outside whispered your name through the wind and dead leaves, and she smiled, not cruel, not kind, but utterly certain. "The fare is always collected, one way or another. Everyone pays." She returned her hands to the wheel, eased the bus into gear. The cemetery gates receded, or perhaps the bus moved forward. It no longer mattered which. In the reflection of the dashboard, her image flickered one last time. For a brief, impossible moment, it was not just the old woman. It was a procession of faces. Every passenger who had whispered just one more hour, only to find themselves slowly transformed. no longer fully human. Every soul who had stared into a screen, feeling it stare back. Every person who believed they knew their destination, only to discover the route had shifted while they weren't looking. All of them wearing the same expression, recognition, arriving too late. The bus rolled forward into a storm that sounded less like rain and more like a chorus of unseen hands, clapping in rhythm with your heartbeat. The darkness outside didn't feel like night anymore. It felt like an ending, a reckoning. Behind it, the cemetery gates yawned wide, iron teeth waiting. Always open, always patient. Route 7. One rust-stained city, streets slick with memory and midnight, where the dead quietly outnumber the living and the living barely notice. On board, there was a driver who had trusted luck too long, a man who learned too late that the universe collects debts without notice, a passenger who discovered that ambition can consume you slowly, filing away your humanity in neat little increments, and a young woman chasing perfection, only to realize the price of beauty is permanent and the contract invisible. Among them, a figure in black, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen everything unfold countless times. She collects stories the way others hoard coins, understanding that every narrative demands payment, and that the most terrifying tales are the ones we've already lived, oblivious to the cost. The bus hummed through puddled streets, the wipers slicing the storm into manageable slivers, while the gates waited patiently in the reflection of the windows. Every stop, every turn, every shadow on the asphalt was a whisper of the destination we all share. The final terminus where the gates stand open, where the balance of debt and passage is finally reconciled. The question hung in the air, heavier than the rain. Will you step off, or have you been aboard this journey all along, trapped in the slow inevitability of your own choices? The bus was pulling up to your stop, and in that suspended moment, the answer was yours to discover. Story 2, where burial means planting. The office in Marfa reeked of dust and old paper, a faint trace of chemical cologne clinging to the air like an afterthought. Harlan Cade followed the woman's sharp finger, signing the document without hesitation. She slid the deed across the counter, her nails painted a deep, dried blood red that seemed almost to warn him. 200 acres, at a price that didn't belong to any earthly ledger. She didn't smile. "Do you know about the fence?" she asked, her voice dry, more statement than question. Harlan glanced at the survey map. "I saw it there," he said simply. Her eyes, pale and hard, narrowed like shutters against a storm. Perhaps 60, perhaps older in spirit, they held the quiet knowledge that the world had long since stopped surprising her. She waited patiently for him to speak more. When he didn't, she turned toward her filing cabinet, leaving the rest unspoken. That was all. Harlan climbed into his truck, a rusting beast that coughed and rattled like gravel trapped in a tin can. The sky stretched above him, the color of broken concrete, and he drove westward, 70 miles of open road stretching like a promise or a threat. He carried $800 in a toolbox and the fragile hope that distance could erase memory. Pennsylvania was gone. The farmland that had cradled generations of cads now belonged to the bank, a foreclosure notice scrawled in indifferent ink. His father's name remained. His own was erased, swallowed by necessity and loss. Harlan remembered that final morning vividly, standing alone in the empty farmhouse kitchen while the bank appraiser scribbled on a clipboard. 3 generations had turned the soil here, had broken their backs under August suns that made men faint, that took his grandfather without mercy. His father had survived until cancer claimed him, only 2 months after the bank's last notice. Harlan had stood at the threshold of that kitchen, the echo of his family's sweat and laughter and sorrow lingering in the walls. He left without looking back, not out of cruelty, not out of triumph, but because some debts cannot be paid with blood alone. Out west, the land waited, silent and expectant, and Harlan knew, somewhere deep inside, that some things could only be planted, not owned. The miles passed. Concrete sky gave way to pale desert, flat and waiting. The fence appeared on the horizon, a thin black line stitched into the land, and with it, the sense that this place demanded more than money. It demanded care, attention, and an understanding that some soil remembers what you bury in it. Harlan parked, stepped out into the dry wind that carried the scent of sage and dust, and for the first time since leaving home, he felt the weight of possibility. The land wasn't just a purchase, it was a promise, and in that promise, perhaps, lay the only way to finally honor what had been lost. The sun dipped behind jagged mountains, casting long shadows across the acreage. Harlan ran a hand along the fence post, feeling its rough grain beneath his fingers. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the earth seemed to pulse. As if alive, as if waiting for the planting of seeds, for the stories of a new generation to take root. And in that quiet, wide-open place, Harlan Cade understood. Some legacies are measured not in acres, nor in money, but in the patience to plant, to endure, and to wait for life to rise again. Like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to understand what it had lost, and what it could still give. Harlan wandered the cracked ranch, boots crunching on dry clay, the wind tugging at the edges of his jacket, as though reminding him he was only a guest here. Each cactus and scrub tree seemed rigid with expectation, each shadow sharp against the sun-bleached earth. The old house sagged under its own weight, the peeling gray paint like skin flacking from bones. He stepped inside again, inhaling the musty scent of time left unattended. The linoleum curled up in corners, lifting like forgotten memories. In the kitchen, the coffee mug stared back at him, a frozen echo of fatherhood and years that could never be recovered. "World's best dad," it read, faded and cracked, as if mocking him with what had been and what had been lost. He left it where it was. Some things weren't meant to travel with you. Some burdens were heavier in your hands than if you left them behind. That first night, the house breathed and shifted around him. Harlan lay in a sleeping bag on the cold floor, listening to the sighs of timber and plaster. Doors opened of their own volition, closing only to creak back again, a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost conscious. Twice he rose to close them, only to find them swinging gently, as if the house itself was testing him, waiting for him to remember whether old houses always had secrets, or whether it was just him, haunted by absent fathers and vanished homesteads. Morning brought the harsh clarity of desert sunlight, painting the land in stark relief. Harlan wandered the acreage, the scrub and mesquite standing like silent guards, the soil white where the wind had stolen its top layer. To the north, a dry arroyo cut through the land like a scar, the soil cracked and lifeless. Discarded beer cans lay in a flattened tire, and nearby, the bleached bones of some long-dead animal stared back at him from the dust. The land wasn't empty. It had been evacuated, stripped bare of its vitality, leaving only husks where life had once clung tenaciously. He thought of Pennsylvania, of fields his father had plowed until the earth offered nothing more, of soil that gave less each year until all that remained was the echo of toil and exhaustion. But this place was different. Here, the silence wasn't resignation, it was expectation. The desert seemed to whisper that with care, with patience, something could be coaxed from it. Life could return in ways small and monumental if he was willing to give more than he thought he had left. Harlan stood in the center of the property, the wind tugging at him, the sun baking his shoulders. He realized then that this wasn't just land to own. It was land to reckon with, land to listen to, land to plant in a way that honored what had been taken and what could yet grow. And for the first time in years, he felt a quiet, unsteady hope stirring in his chest, a promise that some things, though buried, could still take root again. Mechanical, almost ritualistic, Harlan's chest tightened as he realized the similarity wasn't coincidence. The earth beyond the fence wasn't just land. It was alive in a way that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. Something moved beneath it, deliberate, persistent, patient. The next morning he approached the fence again, sun low and pale in the sky. The metal burned under his fingers, a thin, whistling note carried on the wind. Each post was perfectly aligned, each sign rigid, unwavering. No trespassing. Contaminated sight. Not warnings, not suggestions. Commands etched in steel and paint. He could almost feel the land itself pressing against the chain link, as though the fence was less a barrier and more a sentinel, marking a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. Harlan followed the line north, feet crunching on the baked clay, eyes scanning for movement. A lizard watched from a jagged rock, throat puffing in rhythmic thumps that matched the distant heartbeat of the earth. He thought of his father's pens back in Pennsylvania, the way the old man had built them sturdy, with extra braces, double gates. Harlan had never questioned it. Some animals needed control, some needed to be observed. This fence, he realized, was no different. Only the livestock were long gone, and something else had taken their place. By afternoon, the neighbor appeared in his weathered truck, a shadow trailing dust. Esteban Morales, eyes sharp as flint, skin carved by decades in the sun, didn't mince words. He asked about family, then fell silent when Harlan said none were coming. Finally, he mentioned the fence. That land beyond was Harlan, not officially, not legally, condemned, contaminated. He had been patient, polite even, but every word carried weight, the sort that pressed into your chest and refused to leave. 30 years, he said, the survey was wrong. 30 years of land marked, claimed, and avoided. And there were things Harlan needed to know. Harlan thanked him and watched the truck vanish in a haze of dust. Alone again, the evening settled around the house like a weight. But that night the wind didn't howl and the house didn't creak. There was something else, something low, rhythmic, insistent. The sound of earth being moved. Soft percussion, deliberate, methodical. Harlan lay in the darkness, jaw tight, listening. The cadence echoed memories he hadn't wanted to recall. His father in the hospice bed, lungs laboring. A rhythm of life wanting yet precise, almost ritualistic. And as he stared at the eastern fence in the moonlight, the realization came like a stone dropped into still water. This land was not empty. It had never been. It waited. It remembered. It would not forgive the careless nor tolerate the unaware. Harlan felt the first prickling of fear, the same cold, steady pull that warns you something ancient has noticed you. Something patient, something deliberate, and whatever it wasn't planning to stop digging. The first time Harlan noticed it, the world felt smaller, as if the horizon had been pulled in closer and the air itself had weight. He'd been sitting on the porch steps, listening to the steady thrum beneath the earth, a rhythm that was not wind, not animal, not anything natural. He counted each thump, each subtle tremor, waiting for it to cease, hoping it would, but it never did. Before dawn, he was at the kitchen window, flashlight in hand. The half-moon cast a silver glow across the scrubland, the fence cutting a dark line through the stars. He crept outside, the cold biting through his jacket, and scanned his side of the chain link. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of movement. He moved the beam along the fence until it caught something pale 30 feet out. Step by cautious step, he approached, parallel to the metal barrier. There it was, a weathered stone, rough-hewn and standing proud like a sentinel. Behind it another, and another, dozens, maybe more, stretching into the shadowy distance where the flashlight's reach faded. Headstones or markers emerging from the earth like teeth breaking through gums. His breath caught, shallow and uneven. He remembered the cemetery in Pennsylvania on the hill above the Cade farm. Old stones, children's markers, graves dug by hands that had known grief. That had been private, personal. But this wasn't grief. Not for family, not for anyone living. The markers stood in uneven rows, silent, intentional, deliberate. A field of memory that didn't belong to him, yet pulled at something deep in his chest. The rising sun turned the scrubland hard, casting every shadow sharp and deliberate. Harlan remained still. A raven landed on the fence 20 feet away, cocked its head at him, and let out a sound like someone choking on words long unsaid. Then it lifted, wings cutting through the morning light, gone before he could blink. He spent the day on the western boundary, clearing brush, fixing the fence, work his hands could do while his mind wrestled with what he'd seen. His father had been the same, laboring to avoid counting losses, to avoid thinking when the weight of memory became too much. But as the sun fell, its angle turning the land into gold and shadow, he found himself drawn eastward toward the markers, as if invisible fingers pulled him along a path. The stones now stood clearer in the amber light. Some bore names, dates, field burials, makeshift monuments. He counted 43, though more surely weighted just beyond the rise where the land curved. One marker nearest the fence glinted in the last light. Jose Reyes, 1974. Nothing else, no epitaph, no explanation, just a name solitary as if left deliberately for him to see. Harlan's chest tightened. Each marker seemed to pulse under the dying sun, a heartbeat from the earth itself. And deep down, he knew he hadn't uncovered a cemetery. He had stumbled onto something far older, far more deliberate, something that had been waiting, something that would not let him leave. The year stamped on the deed felt like a signature on a receipt, final, irrevocable. The diner in Marfa was harsh with fluorescent lights, mostly empty, the kind of place where time seemed to hang between the booths and the counter. Harlan slid onto a stool, ordered black coffee, and when it arrived steaming, he asked about the Deacon place. The waitress was maybe 40, dark hair pulled back tight, and the tiredness around her eyes was etched in like it belonged there. She didn't flinch. She refilled a ketchup bottle that was already full while she spoke, as if her hands had their own memory. Ray Deacon had run a halfway house back in the 60s and 70s, taking in parolees, addicts, anyone released from the state hospital. He put them to work. The county paid him a stipend. But people started vanishing, not in one awful sweep, but quietly, deliberately. One here, one there. Faces that hardly anyone noticed were missing. Deacon always had a reason, and for a while the world believed him. Who would stir trouble over the forgotten? She paused midwipe on the counter, though it was already spotless. In 1976, an anonymous tip brought a state investigator out to the property. Dogs, ground-penetrating radar, careful digging, and they uncovered 38 bodies buried in that far corner. More they suspected, but the earth had swallowed those secrets too deep to uncover. Deacon ended it himself before the law could reach him. The fluorescent hum filled the diner as a metal tray rang somewhere in the kitchen. The county didn't know what to do. The bodies were too far gone. Families were mostly untraceable. So they fenced it off, condemned the section, and eventually sold the rest of the land cheap. 3 different owners tried it in 1976. None lasted more than 2 years. The waitress met Harlan's eyes briefly, and it was enough. Some questions carried their own answers. Some warnings only needed a single word to be understood. She turned away. Harlan drove back under a sky so dark it felt like the road itself had been erased. His headlights carved a fragile tunnel through the night, beyond which there was nothing but emptiness. He thought about turning around, heading back to Pennsylvania or anywhere else. But Pennsylvania offered nothing but the ghost of failure in his father's silent face as the bank came calling. His father hadn't argued, hadn't resisted. He had simply stood there, accepting the inevitable like a man who had already lost. Harlan had wanted to fight, to shout, to claw back what was theirs. But in that quiet understanding, he knew. Sometimes resistance changes nothing, and surrender is only another word for survival. The house was cloaked in darkness when Harlan arrived. He was certain he'd left the kitchen light on, yet the windows reflected only black, cold, and unwelcoming. He sat in the truck a moment, engine humming, staring at the empty panes as though willing them to answer. Inside, every switch he flipped revealed only shadows. Could be a simple power flicker, he told himself. Could be something else. Room by room, he moved cautiously, closet by closet, like a child hunting monsters that weren't supposed to exist. The house was as empty as it had ever been. Almost. In the bedroom closet, he noticed the baseboard sagging. Kneeling, he pried it back. Behind it, the wall gaped, a hollow cavity where insulation had been stripped away. Inside lay a single scorched page, the edges blackened as though someone had tried to incinerate it and stopped mid-flame. The handwriting screamed across the paper, slanted hard to the right, pressing deep enough to leave an impression. The fence is wrong. Should be around the house, not the burial ground. Deacon knew he built wrong on purpose. The house shouldn't be here. Should have burned it down. Should have burned it all. They won. The sentence trailed into a long smear. The pen dragged across the page in panic. At the bottom, in calmer, steadier ink, Garrett, May 3rd, 2023, 3 months before the man sold to Harlan. He folded the page carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and restored the baseboard. The previous owner had fled, leaving a warning. Now Harlan understood why. Sleep eluded him that night. Beyond the eastern fence, the sounds had changed. No longer the scraping, digging rhythm of earth being moved. Now a quiet settling, a subtle shift, as if the land itself were adjusting to its burden, or the burden adjusting to the land. By midnight, he gave up and stepped outside. The air cut like steel, stars so thick they threw faint shadows over the scrub. He approached the eastern fence without turning on his flashlight, letting the starlight guide him. The field of stones lay just beyond, closer than he remembered, as if they had shifted in the night. Impossible, he knew. His mind wanted to make patterns where none existed. Still, one marker, the sharp-topped one, had lined up exactly with a fence post before. His father had seen things near the end, visitors long dead, conversations with people who should not have been there. The hospice nurse had chalked it up to the dying brain, desperate to impose order on chaos. But his father's certainty had been frightening, the recognition in his eyes, the words spoken as though old friends had returned. Something moved low in the scrub beyond the markers, a coyote maybe, or a fox, or just the wind brushing a creosote branch. Harlan clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the stones. Nothing. He followed the fence north, each step measured, heart tight, shadows stretching with him, the quiet settling of the earth a pulse he could not escape. The dull orange paint on the fence posts glimmered faintly under Harlan's flashlight, each sign a repeated warning he could barely read but understood instinctively. At the far northern edge, where the fence met the property boundary, the chain link was ripped, a jagged gap 3 feet across sagging toward the ground. Age had weathered the metal into the same rusted orange as the rest. Kneeling, he studied it. Something had passed through here, or come through. The dirt on both sides was hard-packed kitsch, no footprints, nothing, except for scraps of fabric tangled in the wire. Denim, faded and stiff with age. His beam caught a shape just beyond the torn fence. He leaned closer, a lone work boot scuffed and cracked lying on its side. Nearby, half buried in the soil, a belt buckle glinted faintly. He thought of the marker he'd read earlier, Jose Rey's 1974. Were these his boots, his buckle? How long did a man's belongings outlast him? Standing, he stepped back. The fence emitted a thin, keening note, a song carried by the restless wind. Turning toward the house, he saw only the diffused glow of the lights he'd left on, struggling against the darkness. Nights became relentless trials. He'd lie in bed, insisting he would sleep, but the sounds always found him. Long stretches of silence, broken by soft percussion, methodical and patient like someone, or something, working far beyond the boundaries of comprehension. He tried reading, tried the small battery-powered radio he'd brought, but words blurred and the radio carried only static. And beneath it all, the rhythm persisted. On the fourth night, he dreamed he was at the fence again. The stones beyond shifted, tilting, sinking, rising in a slow, impossible rhythm, like the land itself was breathing. In the dream, he understood. The dead were not still. Burial meant nothing. The earth was temporary, a lesson the dead were learning to transcend. He woke drenched in sweat, standing in the kitchen with no memory of rising. The eastern window faced him. Outside, the fence was visible in the dim light before dawn, and beyond it, the stones stood like silent sentinels. Then, he noticed movement among them, too dark to make out, but unmistakably upright, human-shaped, purposeful. Heart hammering, he snatched his flashlight and ran outside barefoot. The soil bit at his feet with sharp stones and thorn scrub, but he didn't hesitate. By the time he reached the fence, the figure had vanished. He swept the flashlight beam across the markers, catching only shifting shadows and the endless, patient stillness of the land. But he knew deep down that what moved among those stones had not retreated. It was waiting, learning, and it had noticed him. Nothing. The shadows thickened, swallowing the edges of the land, leaving only the faint outline of the fence and the stubborn, silent stones beyond. His chest heaved, the pain in his feet and back screaming louder than the wind through the scrub. The jacket remained, a dark accusation pinned to the earth, arms splayed as if reaching for him. Harlan didn't move. He stood rooted, letting the last of the light fade, letting the chill creep up his legs, letting the silence press against him like a weight. Somewhere beyond the fence, the rhythm had returned, soft percussion, slow and deliberate, like the earth itself was working beneath his feet. He could almost swear the stones shifted, minutely, almost imperceptibly, each one tilting just enough to remind him he wasn't in control. By nightfall, he had covered himself in sweat and grime, the new fence a rigid, stubborn line marking where he believed safety ended. But the bundle, the jacket, was a reminder that some boundaries weren't meant to hold. He could see the denim in the faint glow of the horizon, arms still outstretched, waiting for the darkness to take it, or for something else to claim it. Harlan knew sleep would not come. He could hear the soft, patient percussion continue into the night, each beat echoing in his bones. The bundle on the stone became more than fabric. It became a signal, a message in the language of the dead. And he knew with a certainty that made his skin crawl that the watchers beyond the fence were aware of him now, patient, deliberate, and moving in ways the daylight could never reveal. He stayed there until the stars thinned, until the chill became unbearable, until he had to retreat inside the empty house. But his eyes never left the stone, never left the jacket, never left the quiet accusation of a line crossed and a warning unheeded. And as he closed the door behind him, he could still hear it, the soft, steady percussion, the sound of something waiting, learning, and counting the days until the line could no longer be defended. The night stretched long and unbroken, and Harlan didn't even try to sleep. He sat in the darkness of the kitchen, shadows pressing against the walls, eyes fixed on the eastern window. Every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves made his heart stutter. He waited, straining for proof that the world had not gone mad, or that he had not. At midnight the sound came, closer this time. Not from the distant scrub, not beyond the fence, but right at it. A faint scrape, fabric brushing against metal, the soft groan of taut wire. His body froze, muscles rigid, breath suspended. Then nothing, just the silence stretching, thick and suffocating. He counted silently, 100, 200, still nothing. Finally he rose and peered through the starlight. Both fences, old and new, stood undisturbed, unwavering. But 10 feet from his freshly strung wire, something dark lay on the ground. The jacket. His hands shook as he fumbled with the door, every instinct screaming to stay inside. But he stepped into the cold night anyway, flashlight raised like a weapon, heart hammering. The jacket was older than memory, faded gray, stiff with dust and decay. He nudged it with his boot. A scent rose, not rot, not decay, but something older, earth that had kept secrets too long. He picked it up, and a small object fell from its pocket, glinting in the beam. A key, brass, tarnished, heavy with age. He turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight and the subtle corruption of the metal, as though it had absorbed the passage of countless hands, countless years. He walked the perimeter of his new fence, flashlight sweeping for gaps. None, every post secure, every wire taut, and yet the jacket had moved. He had seen it on the other side. Now it was here. The key burned in his palm, a silent demand, a question without words. He looked back toward the house. The lights seemed impossibly distant, fragile beacons against the growing dark. Memories came unbidden. In Pennsylvania, his father had kept a key to the old equipment shed on a nail by the door. Harlan had held it in his hand countless mornings and evenings, feeling the weight of labor, of care, of generations. The day the bank took the farm, he had thrown that key away, refused to carry it west, refused to carry the burden. And now, another key, another weight, waiting for him, demanding acknowledgement. He stuffed the jacket into a trash bag and left it outside, but the key he set on the counter, staring at it like it held a message he could not decipher. Near dawn, sleep claimed him at last, hunched over the kitchen table, neck stiff, back aching. When he woke, the sun was high, pale light slicing across the room, and something had shifted. The key was no longer on the counter. It sat on the floor by the front door, placed with precision, angled toward the threshold like an arrow, like a question aimed straight at him. Harlan knelt slowly, the weight of understanding pressing down, heart thudding in his ears, knowing that the night had left him a message, and that the land, the fence, the stones beyond were far from finished speaking. From where he stood, the key seemed to stare back at him. It had been on the counter. He knew that with a certainty that sat heavy in his chest. Now it waited by the door, positioned with intention, as if it wanted air, space, purpose, as if it wanted to be carried back outside. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The trash bag was gone. The place where he'd left it was clean, undisturbed, as though nothing had ever been there. In daylight, the fence was just metal and posts. The stones beyond were just stones. Everything made sense if you forced yourself not to linger on it. But Harlan lingered anyway. His mind refused to let go. That afternoon, Esteban Morales arrived again. The old man stood in the yard, studying the new fence with tired eyes, and shook his head slowly. Said it wouldn't matter. Said whatever Harlan thought he was blocking had already crossed the line. Then Esteban told him something he'd never meant to repeat. His grandfather had been one of the men hired in the 70s, back when the state came looking. Local hands paid in cash to help dig. The ground hadn't wanted to open, the old man had said. Fought every shovel. The bodies were deep, too deep, placed with care, like someone who'd had a lot of practice. People used to see Deacon out there at night, Esteban said, just standing in the dark, staring at the earth, like he was listening, like he was waiting for replies. Maybe he heard them, Esteban said quietly. The ones he put down there, maybe they never stopped talking. After Deacon died, they searched the house, found notebooks, names, dates, far more than the bodies they uncovered. The county burned the journals, said there was no other way to close it. Some things didn't need to survive on paper. Esteban told Harlan he needed to choose soon, whether he could live with this place or whether he had the wisdom to leave it behind. Harlan asked what would happen if he stayed. The old man's answer was simple. Some land doesn't want to be owned. It wants to own. When Esteban drove away, Harlan remained in the yard as the light slowly drained from the sky. Eventually, he went inside, locked every door and window, turned on every light and sat at the kitchen table. He thought about his father's farm, about years of fighting soil that gave less and less until there was nothing left to take. His father had believed the land betrayed him. But maybe it wasn't betrayal. Maybe some ground was finished. Maybe everything taken after that point was theft. The sound started earlier that night, not at the fence, at the house. Soft, measured impacts against the walls, too steady to be wind, too intentional, like something learning the shape of the place. He moved from window to window with the flashlight, seeing nothing. Still the sounds continued, circling, patient. At the back door, at the bedroom window, at the front threshold, as if whatever waited outside already knew exactly where to knock. The porch met the foundation, then the house fell silent, thick with anticipation. Harlan stood in the middle of the kitchen, spinning slowly, ears straining. The air was heavy, almost alive, and then the front doorknob began to turn, slow, deliberate. The bolt was set locked tight, yet the knob rotated anyway, testing, learning, probing. It stopped, poised in the center as if satisfied or amused. Harlan held his breath. Then came the scratching, faint, measured at the bedroom window. Not a threat, just presence, patient. A message he couldn't ignore. He moved toward it with the flashlight, trained the beam across the glass. His own reflection stared back. Behind it, shadows shifted, something withdrawing into the darkness. He thought of his father, speaking to visitors long dead, acknowledging corners no one else could see. Perhaps those visions weren't hallucinations. Perhaps the dying could perceive what the living could not. Perhaps his father had known something profound in his last days, something Harlan was only beginning to grasp. Morning found him slumped against the bedroom wall, flashlight dead in his hands, mouth dry, back stiff, knees cracking as he rose. The house was still, daylight spilling through windows, revealing nothing to find. He stepped outside, walked the perimeter. No footprints, no disruption. Yet on the porch by the front door sat the key, same key, laid like a silent accusation. This time he didn't take it inside. He carried it to the eastern fence, hurling it with all his strength over both barriers. It arced through the air, disappearing into the field of stones. "That'll settle it," he muttered to himself, to the fence, to whatever eyes might be watching. But deep down, he knew better. Later, he drove into Marfa County office papers clutched in his hands. A younger clerk led him to records stretching back decades. 3 owners since 1976. First, a couple from California, 8 months. Then a rancher from Wyoming, 15 months. Finally, a man named Garrett, 11 months before selling to Harlan. No forwarding addresses, no contacts, just names, dates, deeds. He left the office and drove home as the sun dipped low. The land glowed red, shadows stretching long and thin, pressing against the horizon. As he pulled into the driveway, Harlan felt the weight of it all. The earth, the silence, the stories buried deeper than any fence could hold. The land waited, patient, and he understood at last. Some things would not be owned. They would only be witnessed. The truck's engine hummed, idling in the dark as Harlan sat tense, staring at the porch. The jacket lay there, arms spread wide, and now atop it rested the key, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Every instinct screamed to stay away, but he stepped out anyway, gathering both objects in his hands. He carried them to the burn barrel behind the house, poured diesel from the truck bed, and struck a match. The fabric hissed and curled, black smoke rising straight into the still night. The key glowed dull red in the heat, stubbornly unyielding. Harlan watched until the flames died, sifting through the ashes with a cautious hand. The key lay there, charred but intact. He left it, went inside, and made coffee he didn't drink, staring out the kitchen window at the encroaching darkness. That night the sounds were different. Not at the fence, not outside the house, but beneath his feet. The floor thrummed with subtle vibration, regular like a heartbeat. He pressed his hand to the linoleum, solid slab foundation, no basement, just earth, and the tremor persisted. A scent seeped up, dense, patient soil, settling under something far too large to see. He stepped outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the perimeter. The burn barrel glowed faintly from residual heat, the key still nestled in its charred bed. Then movement caught his eye. Across the fence, among the field of stones, a figure stood upright, human-shaped. Harlan's throat tightened, his voice failed him. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react to the beam. He approached the fence slowly, each step measured. The figure resolved, wooden, not flesh, a post, weathered, one of the original markers, though he could have sworn the area had been cleared. The stones beyond seemed to shift as he shone the light across them, rose closer together, some newer, fresher, pale against the earth. Where once there had been 43, now there were 50, 60. Each marker seemed to lean ever so slightly toward him. His light fell on the base of the nearest marker, something organic, small, half buried. Fingers curled upward from the soil like roots. Harlan stumbled back. The beam swung wildly, catching another marker, the curve of a skull breaking the surface. And beyond it, something else. Something that hadn't been there before, something waiting, patient, impossible to ignore. The field was alive in its own terrible rhythm, and Harlan realized, with a chill that ran from spine to toes, that the land had not finished revealing its secrets. Emerge fully, or if they linger in the soil, restless, patient, waiting for someone to finish what was started. Harlan's breath hitched as he gripped the key tighter. The fence wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was an invitation, a promise. He stepped through the gap, boots sinking slightly into soft, churned earth. The stones pressed in around him, more than he had imagined, each one leaning, subtle but intentional, as if the ground itself was alive and aware of his presence. Names and dates scratched roughly into sandstone. Some faded beyond recognition, others painfully clear. 1974, 1976, the same decades his grandfather had whispered about in hushed tones. And beneath them, the soil heaved, small eruptions of earth, as if what lay beneath was testing the surface. The vibration underfoot had grown into a pulse, a heartbeat, syncing with the rhythm of his own. Harlan felt it in his chest, in his bones. Shadows stretched unnaturally around each marker, the stars above powerless to penetrate the growing darkness. Then a hand broke the soil ahead, a wrist, fingers curling, grasping at air. Another followed, a rib, a shoulder blade, and then more, slow and deliberate, pushing up through the earth as if the ground itself was exhaling its buried weight. He ran stumbling, tripping over roots and loose stones. 10 steps, 20 before his foot caught and he fell hard. Dust and grit filled his mouth and nose. The flashlight flew from his hand, spinning across the churned dirt and dying with a faint click. In the silence that followed, the fence sang again. 2 notes, thin, eerie, the sound of metal under tension. Harlan scrambled to retrieve the light and trained it on the gap. The tear had widened, the chain link pulled back like a wound, revealing the stones closer than ever. Panic gripped him and he bolted for the house, slammed the door, flipped every switch. Inside, the vibration beneath the floor became undeniable, a low, omnipresent hum through boots, chair, and walls. Midnight brought the scratching, nails on glass, soft, persistent, everywhere at once. He sat in the kitchen, back to the stove, watching the windows reflect his own face, multiplied like ghosts. Then the doorknobs began to turn, front, back, bedroom, all slow, deliberate, testing the locks, learning their resistance. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the key rested on the counter, impossibly returned from the burned barrel. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Cold now, worn smooth by decades, and etched into it, R.D., Ray Deacon. The floor rumbled, dust sifted down, lights flickered. Understanding struck like a hammer. There was a lock here on this land, something Deacon had sealed, and the dead wanted it opened. They had been waiting for someone to try. Harlan stepped outside, key clenched in his fist. The night was sharp, stars piercing the darkness. The fence glowed dull, the tear wide enough to pass through. He stepped over the threshold, the churned earth soft beneath his boots, stones pressing closer, names and dates clear, carvings raw and hurried. The ground shifted beneath him, and a hand emerged, then a shoulder, then more. A skeletal procession, rising from decades of buried secrets. He paused, breath ragged, heart hammering, and realized the truth. The dead were not still. They had been waiting, patient, deliberate, until someone dared to walk the line between living and buried. And now, the key in his hand was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a reckoning, and the land at last was awake. People say the dead stay quiet once the dirt settles. It's a story we repeat to make night feel safer. But the moment he crossed the broken fence, that story fell apart. The soil on the other side gave way beneath his boots, spongy and warm as if it had been turned too many times. Each step sank deeper than it should have. The stones stood around him in silence, watching, not as markers, but as guardians. The metal in his hand burned now, pulsing, guiding him forward like it knew where it belonged. At the center of the field stood a monument unlike the rest, taller, cleaner, not weathered sandstone but dark granite that had resisted time. At its base, nearly hidden, was a steel plate set flush with the earth, rusted, scarred, and in the middle, an old keyhole. His knees hit the ground without him deciding to kneel. The key slid in perfectly, too perfectly. When he turned it, something deep beneath the land answered. A heavy click, then another, locks disengaging after decades of waiting. The plate shuddered, a seam opened, and from below came the smell, fresh earth mixed with something ancient, something that had never learned how to rest. Then the sounds began. Not voices, not words, breath moving without lungs, sound shaped like memory and hunger. He tried to pull the key free. It wouldn't budge. His hands shook as the plate lifted on its own, iron hinges screaming in protest. Beneath it, stone steps descended into a darkness that swallowed light whole. The noises grew louder, closer, demanding. He stumbled backward as the opening widened. The key remained trapped, fused to its purpose. And as dawn bled into the sky, a hand appeared over the edge, fingers clawing stone. Then an arm, a shoulder. A head rose, hair matted and stiff, a face carved from dirt and bone, and something that still remembered being human. Its mouth moved, shaping words that never came. He ran. He tore back through the fence, hit the ground hard, rolled, scrambled upright. When he looked back, the figure stood at the edge of the opening. Not chasing, just watching. And behind it more shapes emerged, pulling themselves free in slow, terrible silence. Birth reversed, patience ended. He reached the house and barricaded himself inside. The windows framed the field, now crowded with figures, dozens of them standing still, waiting, not attackers, judges. That's when he understood. The fence had never been a prison. It was a warning line, a boundary marking where no home should stand, where land was never meant to be owned. The house was the trespass. The sun rose fully, and the shadows of the figures stretched across the ground, long, narrow, and unmistakably pointing at the house. He sank to the floor and watched, unmoving. Outside they remained, silent, patient. They had all the time the earth allows. He had never owned it, could never own it. The moment he realized that, the earth beneath the house began to move. At first, subtle shifts, floorboards tilting, plaster cracking, the foundation groaning as if protesting the weight of human ambition. Every step, every corner of the house strained against ground that had long been unsettled, layered with secrets and things better left alone. He felt it first in his feet, then through his bones. The house was leaving him behind. Outside, the figures remained unmoving, patient as the soil itself. Inside, walls creaked, dust fell like snow, and the air grew thick with the scent of something old, something ancient. Then the floor gave way. Darkness swallowed him. The house collapsed, folding 30 years of human presumption into the dirt, timber, drywall, and memory merging with the earth that had always waited. He landed hard in soft soil, the air heavy, almost alive. Debris rained around him. A beam missed his head by inches. A kitchen sink embedded itself in the dirt a few feet away. When the shaking finally stopped, he found himself in a cavity barely wide enough to breathe, alive but trapped, enveloped by packed earth and by shapes. Bodies pressed into the dirt around him, planted, row by row, silent and unmoving. A hand brushed his shoulder in the darkness. He screamed, and the sound died beneath the weight of the soil. Above ground, the figures lingered among the stones, watching, waiting as the land reclaimed what had been built upon it. By noon, the scrubland returned to calm. Mesquite kitsch, the faint shimmer of dust in sunlight. The fence remained thin and rusted, a note in the wind, meaningless now. The stones kept their vigil patient, eternal. Among them a new marker, rough, raw sandstone, freshly placed. The wind carried its steady, constant whisper across the land. Beneath the soil where the house had stood, the ground held its secrets, its debts paid in full. Somewhere deep below, a key turned once more in a lock that would never open again. The account was settled. The land had endured, whole and unclaimed, just as it had always meant to be.